With this latest chapter of One Punch Man, we finally receive the grand finale of our Monster Association arc, and boy oh boy was it unreal. First and foremost, we received one of the most powerful fist bumps in all of fiction, as the fists of Garo and Saitama meet in full color, accompanied by the words, "Awakening of the Gods." Now that is most definitely a hefty proclamation, and as you can see, there is something a bit off about Garo's arm here, which we will come to better understand later on in the chapter. Kicking things off in blurring motion, we'd have Garo reeling back a punch from a distance, only to then cut said distance almost immediately by way of a warp gate, intending to assail Saitama, who had instead managed to successfully avoid the blow entirely. Yet as Garo's arm remained extended beyond, Saitama would seize the opportunity and use the gate Garo had opened to do what he couldn't, and deliver. And as he flew back, Garo opened yet another gate, doing so in an attempt to catch Saitama off guard from behind. The two would then strike one another in perfect unison, as if engaged in the most violent display of synchronized dance ever performed. Garo kicked onto Saitama's head, embedding him further into the rubble beneath his feet, and Saitama gritted his teeth as he plunged his fist deep into the abdomen of the space-themed hero hunter, therefore sending him right back from whence he came. Yet in the fraction of a millisecond that took Garo's body to partially emerge from yet another rift in time and space, hoping to hit the bald wonder, Saitama had propelled upwards. Now located on a massive boulder above Garo, he'd suddenly launch off faster than any rocket ever conceived. The sheer force of this would easily shatter the impromptu foothold as he would uphold his depraved expression. From there, he would deliver a chop onto Garo's neck, what I find to be pretty disrespectful to a character that so thoroughly prides himself on his martial arts prowess. But then again, it wouldn't be the first time. But good lord, this time, the fallout would distort the world around them. Saitama intended to disrespect Garo here by copying the man's moves and use them against him. Once Garo realized this, Saitama would begin to taunt him, bringing up the fact that Garo previously swore to copy Saitama when he's serious for the sake of surpassing him. Saitama now would beckon him to do so. No matter what, he was going to punish Garo. At this point, Garo was being pummeled, and he had no idea how, since he was countering the guy with just as much power. Yet every time Saitama hit him, these strikes became harder and harder, to the point where he could not keep up. Garo would plunge his fist into Saitama's stomach, only to then receive a mean uppercut to the chin, as he recognized himself to be far behind Saitama at this point. Anytime he met Saitama, the bald man would suddenly excel even further beyond. The attacks were becoming both more numerous and more dangerous. At this rate, Garo knew as his body began to break down that eventually, one of these punches would prove to be fatal and kill him. Garo may be able to match Saitama's strength from moment to moment, but he certainly cannot do so in regards to the man's durability and endurance. But what is downright chilling is the announcement that even at this point, Saitama was continuing to grow. As it turns out, his rate of growth had gone completely unnoticed by all on account of nobody being even remotely on par with his strength. Yet on account of his loss of Genos, his already virtually incomprehensible growth rate had increased exponentially. This was all on account of a surge of emotions, the likes of which he had never experienced before. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the equivalent of Saitama going Super Saiyan on planet Namek. And based on this associated chart, Saitama is now at least twice as powerful as Cosmic Fear Mode Garo, and that is only in a matter of milliseconds. We are counting milliseconds here. Remember, this fight is going at the speed of light and beyond, so this is at the millisecond mark. If this were to go on for a minute long, too, that is just downright mind-boggling, especially when we consider the fact that even now, in holding Genos' core and deciding not to outright kill Garo, Saitama is still holding back. Regardless, the base level has risen. We have actual confirmation that Saitama does in fact continue to grow, and that is both an incredibly hype yet terrifying revelation. Frankly, this uproots everything we know about the guy. Garo, right now, in this particular moment, in this particular instance, is the only one strong enough to observe Saitama's growth. But Saitama was growing so fast that at this point, he would not be able to do so for much longer. Saitama, however, was beginning to get a bit chilly on account of having his whole outfit destroyed, which is very fascinating indeed, as we now have an idea of just how cold conditions need to be in order for him to even remotely feel the effects. Note that on average, the temperature of outer space is negative 455 degrees Fahrenheit, or negative 207 degrees Celsius. Now that is just crazy. Garo now was very frustrated by the increasing futility of his efforts and would attempt to get a warp punch off yet again. a pointless attempt as Saitama would catch his fist without issue. And it was in that very moment that Saitama had gotten way too far for Garo to even comprehend his power. Saitama would begin to inhale on the precipice of a sneeze. And sneeze he would, doing so with enough force to part the sea of debris behind Garo. This was a serious sneeze, and in mere moments, it would not only collide with the gas giant known as Jupiter, but furthermore disperse the hydrogen sea of the planet to the point of clearly, very clearly, exposing its core. Now mind you, in regards to size, according to NASA, if Earth were the size of a nickel, Jupiter would be as big as a basketball. Suffice to say, it is a good thing there are no holes in Garo's armor. The sneeze would send the two hurtling elsewhere as Garo's fear of Saitama began to really show. He was sure that someone like Saitama shouldn't be able to walk around on Earth on his own, only to then think to himself that perhaps the same could be said about him. And here the visuals for Garo kind of remind me of how Phoenix Man looked towards the end of his life. However, just then, Garo would notice his son, and soon after just a bit more scanning, he would also take notice of Earth. Knowing that all he needed to teleport to a location was to have it within range of view, Garo believed luck to still be on his side here. For the sake of making his escape, Garo would punch Saitama in the face, resulting in an expansion of a massive ball of light. And with this, he would rush away from the hero, then use his teleportation to take him elsewhere. And with this, Garo successfully made it back to the hospitable planet, and doing so, believed himself to be the victor. But to spoil his fun would be Saitama just behind him, complimenting the convenience of Garo's move as victory and hope left the eyes of the young man. Now shaking horribly, Garo could not make sense of things as he was certain to have sent Saitama flying in the other direction, to which Saitama would respond to by saying that he had a stomach ache from the cold and was holding it in. But when the flash of light surprised him, a fart came out, propelling him just behind Garo as he had just enough momentum to catch up. What an absolutely ridiculous and juvenile move, but totally a Saitama one indeed. And before Garo could even respond, he would have Saitama's fist to taste as the hero brought them back down to the planet below. Saitama here is humbling Garo by bringing him back down to Earth. Once they met the ground and Saitama looked down, the false visage of his own face would be shattered and destroyed. Saitama, now recognizing the location to be the same as before, would wonder if Garo was aiming to come back here specifically. As Saitama lifted his fist, Garo would wonder why he wasn't being killed. Saitama would pause for a moment before admitting that compared to someone with so many quick costume changes like Garo or King, he wasn't really cut out for this line of work at all, and he hated it. But the reason he had spared Garo was because he is a hero. Not only that, but it was Tadeo's final request that he stop Garo without killing him. Now Garo didn't really hear much beyond that last part, as he would then look away from Saitama. And what he saw was the lifeless body of young Tadeo. And absolutely nothing chilled him more than that. The sight of the boy he so cared for, now being so devoid of life, crushed him as he cried out in despair. Garo would then get back on his feet and run in the opposite direction while screaming. A reaction which confused Saitama as again, Tadeo was in the opposite direction. And it's with this that we would now have Cosmic Tear mode Garo as he cried his eyes out, knowing damn well that this was all because of him. That he was too close to Tadeo and it killed him. From there, Garo would trip on a rock and fall as he continued to sob. And as he did so, he'd recognize himself to be the ominous future. Saitama would admit that Garo had been acting strangely since he fell down from the sky, and would ask if the guy was sure some weirdo didn't do something to him. Garo's only response would be that if they did, it was because his spirit was too weak to begin with. Garo found his own story to be so laughable as by failing to defeat Saitama, he couldn't possibly become absolute evil. And to make matters worse, the hero that took him down doesn't even believe he is suited for hero work. If only Saitama could have pretended for his sake, that if only Saitama simply killed him, fueled by his own lofty sense of justice, he would have gone out like the villain he intended to become. That now the person he wants to save first by changing things was gone. All because of him. A notion which Saitama would question, wondering if instead, Garo was just clinging to him for support. A concept which angered Garo, as in his mind, a being of such unimaginable power couldn't possibly fathom the prospect of leaning on another. But when he looked at Saitama, he corrected himself. He took notice of Genesis' core, which was still within Saitama's grasp, and realized that even Saitama was acting similarly. He couldn't believe that someone of this level of power could be mentally normal. Saitama would then question what Garo intended to do from here. Garo, with his posture slumped, would ask Saitama for a favor. Garo's proposal was for Saitama to copy him, which Saitama found to be a bit strange. After all, he would be copying a copycat. But Garo, despite not wanting to see Saitama with the hands, still wasn't a fan of his mockery. This chapter was already crazy, but here is where things become truly unbelievable. It was Garo's firm belief that Saitama should be able to replicate his techniques and even go as far as to surpass them. What he intended to do was provide to Saitama the most powerful ultimate technique of his fist that even he has yet to make use of, despite having stolen the power of God. Garo felt entitled to Saitama's gratitude, but Saitama wasn't really feeling it, as this was hardly a polite way to request a favor. Saitama also didn't see the point, but Garo insisted that he try and see the results for himself. And after seeing the newfound resolve in Garo's eyes, Saitama would agree, willing to take whatever he could at this point. And at that, it only made sense for someone like Saitama to skip ahead to the ultimate technique. Garo would then begin his demonstration, fully believing that if someone could stand to master the power of God without taking the creature's hand, it would be Saitama. From which point, however, God would decide to rescind the gifts of Garo, a declaration that this time, Saitama would actually be able to hear, interestingly enough. The chitinous exterior would then begin to fade from Garo's body, what oddly enough tasted like salt to Saitama. But this was no time for that, as Garo would yell out for his former adversary to concentrate, which Saitama would follow, giving his full attention. And in doing so, the two men would begin to imagine their own inner universes, which is just madness, mind you. Within Garo, there were particles and antiparticles created in pairs by his cosmic rays. And as each subatomic particle began moving in opposite directions, the two began to imitate the movements of the other. Meanwhile, when the particles within Saitama did this, something monumental would occur. Garo would then tell Saitama to go and defeat it. From here, Saitama would jettison beyond reality. Garo had faith in Saitama more than anyone now. He placed the responsibility of taking down that ominous future onto him as his last words before being made into a brittle statue that blew away in the wind after God reclaimed all of his power. And with this, Saitama began to travel back in time. Talk about mind-blowing. I mean, even Saitama was in awe. And with that, he would finally recognize Garo's martial arts to be incredible after all. But while shifting through time, Saitama would hear Garo's past self claim to be the ominous future, disaster-level God. Saitama wasn't all too privy in regards to the nuance of all this time travel stuff, but did as he was told to the best of his ability and swung towards the prior instance of Garo. With that, we would head back to the moment where Cosmic Fear Mode Garo stood before the many heroes and they became overcome with fear. And you already know it is smelling crazy in that location at this point. Garo again would look to the sky and begin to utter the words "thank you," only to be interrupted by a major fist to the face. Saitama had irregularly been further empowered during his time on Io, and by way of going back in time, his fist landed before it was thrown. This was a reversal of causality. The typical notion of cause and effect had been rendered irregular in this particular instance, and the blow was completely and utterly unavoidable. In fact, confusingly enough perhaps, this didn't actually take one punch. It literally took 0 punches to finish this battle. Long story short, science is freaky. Now interestingly, plenty of heroes are here to witness this act by way of Saitama, which is quite contrary to the typical situation with him. We even have Genos alive and somewhat well, calling out to him and claiming him to be his master publicly. Bang would cry out Garo's name, which would then prompt many of the heroes on the scene to recognize this to in fact be the Hero Hunter, which is a big deal, as regardless of their understanding of his capabilities at this point or not, Garo had managed to defeat several S-class heroes, so to beat him just like that is huge. Garo would recoil from the strike and quickly begin to feel his power escaping him as he clutched onto himself in confusion and despair. From his body would soon emerge an illuminating light that covered the entirety of the surrounding area. But before anything else, Saitama would suddenly be pulled in a certain direction. As this timeline Saitama finally emerged from the rubble he was beneath, future Saitama, as we'll call him, was on the verge of crashing with his prior self, now actually realizing what was happening, as once they met, they become one. And once they were, Saitama here was now really confused. He'd wonder what he was doing, as he could only remember Garo using a special move, which is to say that his memories of the ominous future had been erased, along with his knowledge of how to time travel. It is a one and done, ladies and gentlemen. However, things didn't entirely go back to normal. Saitama's eyes would suddenly widen, as in his hands as he shook in terror was Genos' core. And to make matters worse, his schlong was out for some reason. What had to be an absolutely terrifying series of events. However, this does tell us something. His body did become one with his quote-unquote future self, which is to say that Saitama got much more powerful. We not only have Saitama times Saitama, we have Saitama times a stronger Saitama. In theory, at least. But yeah, in the midst of his fear, Genos would intrude by headbutting his master, knocking him a distance away and onto his head. Genos, having done a far less playful version of this to Garo in the previous timeline, would apologize to Saitama for getting too carried away. However, Saitama was just glad Genos was still alive despite the core in his hand. Now frankly, this was a very hefty and dense chapter of One Punch Man. And so with that, there is most definitely a whole lot that we'd like to further discuss with all of you over the course of subsequent uploads, so please be sure to be here for all of those. And please let us know what you thought about this. My mind is just blown. Saitama can time travel? Like, what? But as always, I'm Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.